They say a mafia boss has no weaknesses, no soft spots, no conscience. But on a cold Chicago morning, in front of 12 witnesses who would never forget what they saw, Jack Wilson proved them all wrong. And it would cost him everything. "She's not breathing!" The words tore from Jack Wilson's throat like a command that could bend reality itself. Gasps erupted across the glass-walled conference suite on the top floor of Wilson Tower. Just seconds earlier, Morgan Benedict, the quiet maid with the white lace headband, had been arranging the morning tea tray near the doorway, her movements careful and invisible the way she'd been trained. The men in the room barely registered her presence. She was background, furniture, forgettable, until she wasn't. Mid-step, her hand flew to her throat, her breath caught, sharp, sudden, terrifying. The silver tray slipped from her fingers and hit the marble floor with a metallic crash that echoed like a gunshot. The room froze. "Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we begin, did you know my mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers? Let's prove her wrong. Please hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to like this video. Now, let's get into it. 12 men in tailored suits, mafia lieutenants, enforcers, consiglieri, men who had seen bodies drop in alleys and blood pool on concrete, stared as Morgan's knees buckled. She collapsed like a marionette with severed strings, her body crumpling in a heap on the cold marble. At first, no one believed it. Someone muttered, "Is this a setup?" Another whispered, "Who the hell let her in here?" A third hissed, "This is a distraction. Check the doors." Then the truth hit. Morgan Benedict wasn't moving. Her lips were shifting from pale pink to an alarming shade of blue, like winter creeping across her skin. But Jack didn't hesitate. The mafia boss shoved past 3 men twice his size, his movements sharp and violent. Chairs scraped. Grown killers stumbled backward. The geometric tattoo stretching up the side of his neck flexed as he dropped to his knees beside her, sliding one arm beneath her head with a gentleness no one in that room had ever seen from him. "Morgan, look at me," he growled, but his voice cracked. Just barely, but enough for the room to hear the fracture beneath the steel. She didn't respond. Her chest wasn't rising. Her eyes were half closed, unseeing. "Boss, don't," someone warned from behind. "She could be poisoned. Contagious. This could be a hit." "Let security handle it," another added, voice tight with panic. "She's dying," a third muttered, as if that explained why they should all stay back. Jack ignored them all. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. Her lips were turning darker now, purple creeping in at the edges like ink spreading through water. He had taken a tactical medical course years ago, back when he was still clawing his way up the ranks, back when survival meant knowing how to keep your men alive long enough to finish the job. The instructor's voice echoed in his head now, louder than the chaos around him. "If they're not breathing, you are their breath." Jack tilted her head back, pinched her nose, and lowered his mouth to hers. The room exploded. "Is he kissing her? The boss? Kissing a maid?" "Jack, stop! This looks—" "Shut up!" Jack snarled without lifting his head. It wasn't a kiss. It was desperation forced into her lungs. 2 steady breaths, controlled even as his hands trembled. Then he locked his palms together over her sternum and began compressions. Hard, rhythmic, relentless. 1, 2, 3, 4. Someone grabbed his shoulder. "Boss, the council is going to hear about this. You can't." Jack shoved the hand away so violently the man stumbled backward into a chair. "Touch me again, and I'll break every bone in your arm." He kept counting, kept pressing, His jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. 15, 16, 17. A sharp pain exploded across his back. Someone had struck him, maybe with a briefcase, maybe something heavier. Jack grunted, his shoulders jerking forward, but his hands never left Morgan's chest. His arms burned, his ribs screamed. Sweat dripped from his temple onto her pale cheek, but he didn't stop. "Get him off her!" someone shouted from the back of the room. "He's contaminating evidence." "This is a scandal, Jack. The family will—" But Jack stayed anchored. His entire world had narrowed to one thing, the rise and fall of her chest that wasn't happening. He leaned down again. 2 more breaths. Deeper this time, forcing life back into her. Then resumed compressions. 25. 26. 27. "Don't you dare die on me," he thought, grinding his teeth together so hard his jaw trembled. "Not here. Not like this. Not because I didn't act fast enough. Then—" Morgan's body jerked violently, convulsing once, hard. She coughed, raw, desperate, dragging air back into her lungs, like someone clawing their way up from the bottom of a frozen lake. Her eyelids fluttered. Color rushed back into her lips, faint but real. She was breathing. Jack collapsed back on his heels, chest heaving, hands shaking uncontrollably. His knuckles were bone white. His back throbbed where someone had struck him. Blood roared in his ears, but she was alive. The room erupted into motion. Men swarming her now, tripping over themselves in clumsy panic, shouting overlapping commands like they'd been the ones to save her. "Call the medic! Clear the hallway! Morgan? Morgan, can you hear us?" The conference doors burst open and Jack's private medical team rushed in with a stretcher and emergency equipment. One of them, a young paramedic with sharp eyes, glanced at Jack still kneeling on the floor with sweat dripping down his face, and asked quietly, "Who started CPR?" "I did," Jack said, his voice hoarse and raw. Before he could say anything more, Vincent Marcello stepped forward, Jack's right-hand man, a man with silver rings on every finger and a face carved from stone. His expression was cold, almost disgusted. "What's your name again?" Vincent asked slowly, as if he didn't already know, as if Jack hadn't built this empire with his own blood. Jack stood slowly, his eyes darkening to something dangerous. "Jack Wilson, your boss." "You put your mouth on the MAID," Vincent said, each word deliberate, "in front of the entire council." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. "She wasn't breathing. I saved her life." "You made a scene," Vincent replied, his voice dropping lower. "This will be reviewed. The council will want answers. You need to leave the floor. Now." For 3 long seconds, Jack stared at him. The kind of stare that had made men beg for mercy. The kind that preceded violence. Then, without another word, Jack turned and walked toward the private elevator, his coat snapping behind him, blood pounding in his ears like war drums. Behind him, Morgan was being lifted onto the stretcher, her body limp and fragile in the hands of strangers. Her eyes opened for just a moment, dazed, confused, struggling to focus, and she saw him. Their gazes locked across the chaos, across the room full of men who wanted to pretend this had never happened. Her lips parted, like she wanted to say something. Then the elevator doors slid shut. And Jack had no idea that what had just happened in that room would unravel everything he'd built and awaken something inside him he couldn't control, couldn't bury, couldn't kill. If you're following this story, stay with me, because the truth behind Morgan Benedict's collapse will shatter every assumption Jack Wilson ever made about loyalty, power, and the one thing a man like him was never supposed to feel. That night, Jack sat alone in the back of his armored SUV as it cut through the Chicago streets like a black knife through the city's cold veins. The lights outside smeared across the tinted windows, neon signs, street lamps, headlights, all blurring into streaks of color that looked like blood running down glass. His driver said nothing. The security detail in the front seat stayed silent. No one dared speak to Jack Wilson when he looked like this. By the time they reached Wilson Tower, the November wind had turned vicious, rattling the glass high-rises and sending trash skittering across the empty plaza like ghosts fleeing the scene. Jack stepped out into the night, his long coat snapping behind him in the wind, and walked through the private entrance without acknowledging the armed guards who straightened at his approach. Inside his penthouse, the silence was suffocating. 50 floors above the city, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Chicago into a glittering kingdom spread out beneath him, Jack poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey he had no intention of drinking. He stood at the window, staring out at the empire he'd built, block by block, deal by deal, body by body. His back still ached where someone had struck him. His hands still remembered the rhythm of compressions, the desperate push, push, push against her sternum, the moment he'd felt her ribs flex beneath his palms. But what haunted him most was the image of Morgan's face, pale as death, lips turning blue, slipping away, and the split second when her eyes had opened and found his across that blood-soaked boardroom. Jack closed his eyes, but the scene replayed in his mind on an endless loop, her hand flying to her throat, the tray clattering to the floor, her knees buckling, her chest refusing to rise no matter how many times he forced air into her lungs. And for the first time in 15 years, Jack Wilson, the man who had clawed his way to the top of Chicago's underworld with nothing but violence, cunning, and an iron will, felt something he thought he'd buried the day he became untouchable. Fear. Not of bullets, not of rivals, not of death. Fear of losing someone who wasn't supposed to matter at all. He opened his eyes and stared at his reflection in the glass. A ghost of a man standing in a tower built on blood and silence, and knew, deep in his bones, that everything was about to change. Because the kiss that saved Morgan Benedict's life had just destroyed his. The nightmares started on the 3rd night. Jack would fall asleep in his leather chair, whiskey glass balanced on the armrest, and within minutes he'd be back in that boardroom. Except this time, no matter how hard he pressed, no matter how many breaths he forced into her lungs, Morgan's chest wouldn't rise. Her lips would shift from pink to blue to purple to black, and her eyes would snap open, lifeless, accusing, and she'd whisper in a voice that sounded like wind through a graveyard. "Why me, Jack? Why did you let me die?" He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart hammering against his ribs, hands shaking so violently he'd have to clench them into fists just to make them stop. By the 5th night, he stopped trying to sleep altogether. Instead, Jack sat in his office at 3 a.m. The city sprawled out beneath him like a sleeping beast, and pulled up the security footage from that morning. He watched it over and over. Morgan entering the room, the tray slipping from her hands, her body hitting the floor, his own figure sprinting forward like a man possessed. But he also watched what happened before she collapsed. He rewound the footage 12 hours. Watched the night cleaning crew cycle through the penthouse floors. Watched them switch out supplies. And there, frame 043722, a figure in maintenance coveralls replacing the glass cleaning solution Morgan always used on the conference room windows. Jack froze the image, zoomed in. The chemical bottle label was different, newer, industrial grade. He made 3 phone calls, The first was to his head of security. I want every staff movement log from the past 72 hours, every keycard swipe, every supply order, and I want the name of whoever authorized the new cleaning chemicals. The second was to his personal investigator. Morgan Benedict, MAID, fired 2 days ago. Find her, now. The third was to Vincent. Pull the employee termination files. Tell me who signed off on removing Morgan from payroll. Vincent's voice was careful, measured. Boss, the council requested. I didn't ask what the council requested, Jack said, his voice dropping to something cold and lethal. I asked who signed it. There was a pause. Then, I did, boss. Orders came from upstairs. They said it was to protect the family's image. Jack hung up without another word. By dawn, he had everything. Morgan Benedict, age 26, lived alone in a fourth-floor walk-up on South Halsted, one of the roughest neighborhoods in Chicago. The kind of place where police sirens were white noise and gunshots were alarm clocks. No emergency contact listed, no family, no friends on file. After being fired, she'd taken a bus home alone. No severance, no final paycheck, nothing. Jack stood, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the private elevator. His driver appeared instantly. Where to, boss? I'm driving, Jack said. The driver blinked. Sir? You heard me. Jack hadn't driven himself in years. The black SUV felt strange under his hands as he navigated through Chicago's early morning streets, the sun barely cresting the skyline, casting long shadows across cracked pavement and boarded-up storefronts. He turned onto South Halsted, and the city seemed to decay block by block. Graffiti climbing up brick walls like poison ivy, trash cans overflowing and burning in alleyways, broken glass glittering on the sidewalks like discarded diamonds. He found her building wedged between a liquor store with bars on the windows and an abandoned laundromat. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. The stairwell reeked of mold and something worse. Something organic and rotting. Jack climbed 4 flights, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. Apartment 4C. The door was slightly ajar. His instincts screamed trap, but he pushed it open anyway. Inside, the studio apartment was barely larger than his walk-in closet. A sagging mattress in the corner, a hot plate on a crate, a single window covered with a bed sheet, and on the mattress, curled into herself like a dying animal, was Morgan. Jack crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside her. Morgan, he said, his voice rough. She didn't respond. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead and jerked it back. She was burning up, fever so high, her skin felt like it might blister under his touch. Her lips were pale again, bloodless, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that rattled in her chest like something broken. Morgan, he said again. Louder this time, his hand cupping her face. Open your eyes. Come on. Nothing. Her body was shutting down. Whatever reaction had nearly killed her in the boardroom was still killing her now. Slowly, agonizingly, alone in this forgotten corner of Chicago where no one would find her until it was too late. Jack slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, one under her knees, and lifted her off the mattress. She weighed almost nothing. Her head lolled against his chest, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late. Then he felt it, the faint, fluttering pulse against his forearm. She was still alive, barely. Jack carried her out of the apartment, down the 4 flights of stairs, past neighbors who opened their doors and stared in shock as Chicago's most feared mafia boss cradled a dying woman in his arms like she was made of glass. He kicked open the building's front door and walked into the gray morning light, his jaw set, his eyes dark with something that looked dangerously close to desperation. His men were waiting by the SUV, faces pale with confusion. "Boss, what? Open the door!" Jack barked. They scrambled to obey. Jack slid into the back seat, still holding Morgan against his chest, her head resting in the crook of his neck. "Drive," he ordered. "Where to, boss?" "North Chicago Medical, private ward. And if you hit a single red light, I'll have your license burned." The driver floored it. The hospital staff took one look at Jack Wilson walking through their doors with an unconscious woman in his arms and moved like their lives depended on it, because they did. Doctors swarmed, nurses wheeled in equipment. Within minutes, Morgan was on a gurney, IV lines snaking into her arms, oxygen mask strapped over her face. "Sir, you need to wait outside," a nurse said gently. Jack didn't move. "Sir?" "I'm staying," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The nurse looked at the doctor. The doctor looked at Jack's face, at the darkness there, the barely controlled violence simmering just beneath the surface, and nodded. "He can stay." Jack sat in a chair beside Morgan's bed, elbows on his knees, head bowed, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Machines beeped around him. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. But all Jack could hear was the sound of her breathing, weak, labored, fighting, the same way he'd fought to bring her back. He closed his eyes, and the boardroom flashed through his mind again. Her body hitting the floor, her lips turning blue, his breath becoming hers. The moment her eyes had opened and locked onto his, like he was the only thing anchoring her to the world. And sitting there in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the ghost of his own fear, Jack Wilson realized something that terrified him more than any bullet, any rival, any war he'd ever fought. He couldn't walk away from her. Not now. Not after this. Because somewhere between the collapse and the kiss, between the CPR and the nightmares, between the moment he'd carried her out of that crumbling apartment and the moment he'd refused to leave her side, she had saved something in him that he thought had died years ago, and she never even knew it. Morgan's eyes opened slowly, like someone waking from a dream they weren't sure they wanted to leave. The fluorescent lights above her were too bright, the walls too white, the air too clean. Her throat felt raw, her body heavy, like she'd been dragged through water for miles. Then she saw him. Jack Wilson sat in a chair beside her bed, elbows on his knees, head bowed, hands clasped together like he was praying or preparing for war. His shirt was wrinkled, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the dark ink that snaked up his forearms. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Why?" Her voice came out broken, barely a whisper. "Why are you here?" Jack's head snapped up. For a moment, something flickered across his face, relief so raw it looked like pain. But he buried it quickly, his jaw tightening. "You're awake," he said, his voice rough. "Why are you here?" she asked again, stronger this time, though her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up. "Don't," Jack said, leaning forward. "Don't move yet. You're still. Answer me." Jack's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. "You were targeted," he said finally. Morgan blinked. "What?" "The chemicals in the cleaning solution. Someone switched them. Put something in that would trigger a reaction in you specifically." His voice dropped, darkening. "Someone used you to get to me." The words hit her like ice water. "Why would anyone—" "Because they knew," Jack interrupted, his fists clenching. "That if you went down in that room, I wouldn't just stand there and watch." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "I can't leave you unprotected," Jack said quietly. "Not now. Not after this." Morgan stared at him, her heart hammering. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything," he said, and the weight in those words made her breath catch. By noon, Morgan had been moved to a private wing of the hospital, one that didn't officially exist on any floor plan. Armed guards stood at both ends of the hallway. Her belongings, what little she had, were transferred from her apartment. Jack had the locks changed, the lease paid off, and a security detail stationed outside even though she'd never go back there. "This is too much," Morgan protested when Jack returned with the doctor in tow. "It's not enough," Jack replied flatly. "You're staying here until you're cleared. Full treatment. No arguments." The doctor checked her vitals, adjusted her IV, and left without making eye contact with Jack, the way people always did when they sensed danger. Morgan watched Jack pace the room like a caged animal. "You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted. "And I will." The council came that evening. Jack was in the hallway outside Morgan's room when 4 men in expensive suits stepped off the elevator. Faces carved from stone, eyes cold and calculating. Vincent led them, his silver rings catching the sterile hospital light. "Jack," Vincent said evenly, "we need to talk." "Then talk," Jack said, not moving from his position in front of Morgan's door. The oldest of them, Carlo Brescia, one of the founding council members, stepped forward. His voice was low, controlled. "She's a liability, Jack. The rumors are spreading. People think you've gone soft, weak." "Let them think whatever they want," Jack said. "This isn't about what they think," another council member snapped. "This is about what they see. You risking everything for a MAID. You moving her into private care. You standing guard like she's—" "Like she's what?" Jack's voice dropped to something lethal. The man shut his mouth. Carlos spoke again, his tone almost sympathetic. "We're not asking you to hurt her, Jack. Just remove the problem. Send her away. Compensate her. Make this go away before it destroys everything you've built." Jack stared at them for a long, silent moment. Then he smiled, cold, predatory, the kind of smile that preceded bloodshed. "Touch her," Jack said quietly, "and you don't live to touch anything again." The hallway went silent. Vincent shifted uncomfortably. "Boss?" "Get out," Jack said. "All of you. Now." They left without another word. Late that night, Jack sat in his private office reviewing security footage for the 100th time. He watched the maintenance worker enter the supply closet, watched them swap the chemical bottles, but their face was always turned away from the camera, deliberate, practiced. Then Jack saw it, a hand reaching for the bottle, and on the ring finger, a gold signet ring with a red stone. A family heirloom passed down through the Marcello bloodline. Jack froze the frame, zoomed in. He recognized that ring. Luca Marcello, Vincent's nephew. A young, ambitious enforcer who'd been pushing for more power, more territory, more influence within the family. Jack's jaw clenched so hard it ached. Luca hadn't been trying to kill Morgan. He'd been trying to kill Jack's reputation, to make him look weak, distracted, unfit to lead. And he'd almost succeeded. Jack picked up his phone and made one call. "Bring Luca to the tower. Tonight. I don't care where he is or what he's doing. Bring him to me." Morgan woke to the sound of hushed voices outside her room. She turned her head, wincing at the stiffness in her neck, and caught fragments of conversation. "Been here every night?" Won't leave her side. "Never seen him like this." She sat up slowly, the ivy tugging at her arm. Through the small window in her door, she saw Jack standing in the hallway, arms crossed, talking to a doctor. Even from here, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the tension in his shoulders. He saved her life in that boardroom, and he'd saved it again when he found her dying in that apartment. But why? She was no one. A maid who cleaned floors and avoided eye contact. And he was Jack Wilson, a man who owned half of Chicago. A man who could have anyone, anything, everything. And yet, here he was, standing guard, refusing to leave. For the first time since she'd woken up, Morgan felt something shift inside her, something fragile and terrifying. Trust and fear. Because if Jack Wilson cared about her survival this much, it meant someone out there cared about her death just as deeply. It was past midnight when Jack finally entered her room again. The hospital had gone quiet, the hallways empty except for the guards he'd posted. He moved like a shadow, closing the door softly behind him. Morgan was awake, sitting up slightly, her eyes following him as he crossed to the chair beside her bed and sank into it like a man who'd been running for miles. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Jack said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, "I should have protected you sooner." Morgan's chest tightened. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the raw honesty in his voice, the guilt, the anger, the fear. So she said the only thing that felt true. "You did." Jack froze. His head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something break open in his expression, something he'd been holding back with sheer force of will. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't expect softness. He didn't expect her. And sitting there, in the dim glow of the hospital room, their eyes locked, the space between them charged with something neither of them had words for, Morgan realized she wasn't afraid of Jack Wilson anymore. She was afraid of what would happen if she let herself feel what was building between them. Because men like Jack didn't get happy endings, and women who loved them didn't survive. Luca Marcello learned Morgan survived at 2 a.m. from a text message meant for someone else. He sat in his car outside a downtown bar, staring at his phone screen, watching his entire plan collapse in real time. The maid was supposed to be dead, or at least disappeared, forgotten, buried under the weight of Chicago's indifference. Instead, she was in a private hospital wing under Jack Wilson's personal protection, which meant Jack knew, or would know soon. Luca's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd spent months positioning himself, whispering doubts about Jack's leadership to the council, planting seeds of discontent. The chemical swap was supposed to be the final nail, proof that Jack was distracted, weak, too focused on a woman to see threats coming. But Jack had saved her. In front of everyone. And now the entire underworld was watching. Luca made a call. I need a hospital uniform, visitor credentials, North Chicago Medical, and I need it in 2 hours. Boss said no one goes near. I don't care what the boss said, Luca hissed. Get it done. If Morgan Benedict died now, it would look like Jack couldn't protect her, and a boss who couldn't protect one woman couldn't protect an empire. The man in the white coat and visitor badge walked past Jack's guards at 4:15 a.m., clipboard in hand, confident stride, face obscured by a surgical mask and glasses. He nodded at the nearest guard. Medication delivery for Benedict. Doctor's orders. The guard hesitated. I'll need to check with... She's seizing, the man snapped. You want to explain to Jack Wilson why you delayed emergency treatment? The guard stepped aside. The man pushed through the door into Morgan's room and found Jack Wilson standing at the window, arms crossed, eyes dark and cold as winter. Wrong room, Jack said quietly. The man froze. Then he bolted. Jack moved like violence given form, fast, brutal, efficient. He caught the man by the back of his collar and slammed him into the hallway wall so hard the drywall cracked. The surgical mask fell away. Luca Marcello stared back at him, blood trickling from his nose. You, Jack said, and the word carried more rage than Luca had ever heard in a single syllable. Jack, wait, I can explain. Jack's fist connected with Luca's jaw, snapping his head sideways. Then another, and another. The guards moved forward, but Jack snarled without looking. Stay back! Luca tried to fight, tried to throw a punch, but Jack was beyond technique now. This was raw, primal fury. He grabbed Luca by the throat and lifted him off his feet, slamming him against the wall again. You poisoned her, Jack growled, his voice barely human. You tried to kill her, twice. It wasn't personal, Luca choked out, clawing at Jack's hand. It was business, strategy. The council, they agree with me. You're weak. Jack's grip tightened. Luca's face turned purple. Jack. The voice was soft, weak, but it cut through the red haze like a blade. Jack's head turned. Morgan stood in the doorway of her room, one hand braced against the frame, her hospital gown hanging loose on her thin frame, IV pole beside her. Her face was pale, her legs trembling, but her eyes were steady. Jack, she said again. Stop. Jack stared at her. For 3 heartbeats, he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't let go of Luca's throat. Then slowly, his fingers loosened. Luca collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing. Morgan took one shaky step forward, then another, her hand reaching toward Jack. Not in fear, in something else entirely. Jack's chest rose and fell like he'd been running. His knuckles were split and bleeding. But when Morgan's fingers brushed his arm, he went completely still. Silent electricity crackled between them, the kind that didn't need words, didn't need explanations, didn't need anything but the space they occupied together. Don't, she whispered. Don't do this for me. It's too late, Jack said, his voice raw. It's already done. Luca was dragged out of the hospital by Jack's men, bloody, broken, and finished. By sunrise, word had spread through every corner of Chicago's underworld. Jack Wilson had found his traitor, and the traitor had learned what happened to men who touched what belonged to him. The council convened an emergency meeting that afternoon. Jack walked into the room alone, his hands still bruised. his eyes daring anyone to speak. Carlo Brescia stood. "Jack, we need to discuss—" "No," Jack interrupted. "You need to listen. Luca Marcello conspired to poison a member of my household to undermine my leadership. He failed. Anyone else who wants to test me can join him in whatever hole he's rotting in. Are we clear?" Silence. "I said, are we clear?" One by one, the council members nodded. Vincent stepped forward last, his face carefully neutral. "The family stands with you, boss." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Good. Because the next person who questions my decisions won't get a second chance." He walked out without waiting for a response. Morgan's recovery was slow but steady. By the end of the week, she could walk the length of the hallway without stopping. By the second week, color had returned to her face. By the third, she smiled, soft, uncertain, but real, when one of the nurses brought her flowers. Jack watched it all from the shadows. He visited less during the day now, afraid his presence would draw more danger to her. But every night, he returned, sitting in that same chair, keeping watch while she slept, his mind replaying the moment she'd stopped him from killing Luca, the moment she'd reached for him, the moment everything shifted. On the night before her discharge, Jack stood by the window of her room, hands in his pockets, staring out at the Chicago skyline. He'd arranged for a safe house, new identity paperwork, enough money to start over somewhere far from this city and the blood it demanded. "You're leaving," Morgan said from behind him. Jack's jaw tightened. "You are. You deserve peace. A normal life. Not this. You don't get to decide that. Morgan, you saved my life, Jack." Her voice was stronger now, steady. "Let me choose what to do with it." Jack turned slowly. She was standing beside her bed, no longer fragile, no longer broken. She looked at him the way no one had ever looked at him before, without fear, without judgment, without anything but raw, unflinching honesty. "You don't know what you're asking," Jack said quietly. "Yes, I do." He shook his head. "I'm not a good man, Morgan. I've done things, terrible things. People like me don't get happy endings." "Then maybe," Morgan said, closing the distance between them, "we don't need an ending. Maybe we just need right now." Jack's breath caught. She was close enough now that he could see the faint scar on her temple from where she'd hit the marble floor. Close enough that he could smell the faint scent of hospital soap and something uniquely her. "You should walk away," he whispered. "So should you," she whispered back. Neither of them moved. Morgan's hand lifted slowly, her fingers brushing against his jaw. The same jaw that had been clenched in fury hours ago. The same face that had hovered over hers when he'd breathed life back into her lungs. Jack closed his eyes, every wall he'd built around himself crumbling under the weight of her touch. And then, Morgan did something that terrified her, more than dying in that boardroom. More than waking up alone in that apartment. More than knowing someone wanted her dead. She leaned forward, 1 inch, then another. Jack's eyes opened, dark and searching, and he leaned down, not with the desperation of CPR, not with the violence of a mafia boss, but with something softer, something real, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Their faces hovered an inch apart, breath mingling, hearts hammering in sync. The first kiss had saved her life. The second would change both of theirs forever.